Hey YouTube, hey viewers, and welcome back to another episode of creating our social network API using Laravel. I first want to apologize for being away for a while. I've been a little bit ill, so I decided to take a little bit of a break. I'm still trying to get over it a little bit, but we'll get there. So if it sounds a little bit grokey, that's just good. Ignore that. But today we're going to look at something a little bit interesting. So we're going to kind of work off the same thing, which is the user stuff that we've been working with. And with that user stuff, I'm just actually going to change the board, sorry. So with our user, we're able to register a user by passing in some body information with my name, email, and then we did the confirmation in the last episode. This episode, we're going to look at something that is known as a repository pattern. So remember inside our code base, if I open it up, we're doing everything inside the controller. And I always say to everybody is that you don't want to make these controllers massive. You want to try to keep them as small as you can, because controllers are more directors. So you push them to do certain things, and really all you want to do is just get responses back from controllers. And we don't want to keep any logic. So for example, this is database logic, if you want to think about it that way. So this is query stuff, so it's stuff to do with the database. This here is kind of like business logic, so I mean this is something separate, and then this is a response, and this is exactly what we want to happen with our controllers. So we're going to do this thing called a repository pattern, and basically it cuts down our way of working into different categories. One will be a service. So a service is where we do all the business logic. So like all this type of stuff. So all the business logic is written inside there. So anything that we want to write, or any like formulas or anything like that, we'll write inside the business logic. And then we have another one on top of that, which is then a repository. And the repository controls all our database stuff. So this is queries, adding things into databases, and etc. But on top of that, we're going to add these things called contracts. And then these contracts kind of solidify our database entries, so anything that we do with data. And you'll see how that all works in this episode. So this might be quite a lengthy one, so hopefully you stick with it. But I would suggest everything that we do from now on will be done in this structure. However, if you want to stick it with this method, you're more than welcome to. That's fine if you don't quite understand how the repository method works. The first thing we want to do is we want to create a service for our register. But basically the service is going to be controlled by this auth controller. So we're going to give it a name for the service. And we can do that quite simply by going into our apps. And you'll notice that we have some folders inside apps. What we want to do is inside there, we're actually going to create a folder inside there called services. So new directory, and we'll call it services. And basically the service is going to be our business logic part. So to do that, we can create a new class inside here, and we're going to call this auth controller. Actually, no, let's call this user service, because that way we can do everything with a user under this. So we can just call it a user service. Okay, so this will create us a nice new file. And really what we're going to do inside here is we're going to do a little bit of logic inside here for this service. And basically we can just call, I don't know, we could just start writing a function if we want to. So public function, let's just do test in this example. Okay, so the question is, how do we actually access this from this auth controller? Well, it's dead simple really, because what we can do is we can use a thing called a construct, which will give us access to this service here. Now, it's dead simple to do, because all we have to do is, if you're in PHP Storm, is you can do underscore, 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 and type in construct. If you want to type it out, it's just as simple as public function, underscore, underscore, construct, and that's it. And inside the construct, we're wanting to make sure that we grab access to our user service. So if we type in user service, you can see it pops up as the type ins, and we want to give it a name, user service. And now this is going to give us direct access to the user service. This is perfect because this is what we wanted for. So just to make sure that we can use it within inside our project, we can quite simply say this user service. So this is the name that we're going to call inside our code all the time. So this user service, and then it'll point to whatever function we create in here, is equal to, and we'll just use this variable. And what we want to do as well, we want to make sure this is a protected variable. So we're going to protect, and we're just going to protect this user service. Already copied it, so we can copy it. So basically this is just saying we're going to use this user service class. We're going to give it this name, this user service. So anytime I want to use it inside my project. And we're just making sure it's just a protected variable. If you're unsure what that means, you can look it up in Google. It's dead straightforward. So once we're in here, we can quite simply, inside our register function, go this, and you can see we can use user service. And then if we arrow off that, we can see we've got test. And basically this can handle our business logic. So obviously we're not going to have it called test. We actually want to give it a proper name. So we're going to call this register user, because that's what it's doing. This auth control is actually just registering a user. So we go register user, and that's basically going to want some parameters for us to use register. So if we have a look at some of our logic here, really the only logic we used to create this user was the stuff from the request. So the request name, request email, request password all came from this request. We made this because obviously we had access to this, so we could quite easily make this access token, not a problem, and then obviously gave us our user. So the only thing we need to pass into this register is going to be this request. So $request. But we can't just pass that, because remember we need all the parameters. And to do all the parameters, we just went off it and said all. And that gives us all the parameters for that register user. So if we go into this register user now, obviously this needs a parameter, and this parameter we could just call data. This can be any name you want. You could call it request, you can call it whatever. In my instance, I'm going to call it data, and I'm going to instantiate it with the name array. So it knows that anything that's coming into this register user is an array of information. So if we just do a DD here, so we can die and dump our data, so we can have a look what's going on here. Go into our Postman and send off the request. We might get some errors because the email might be in use. Go slow every time. Yeah, so the email's already in use. Remember, that's our validation that we put in, which is pretty cool. There we go. So if we have a look, we've got all our array data which we wanted. Perfect. So now what we can do is inside our auth controller, we can start nicking some information. So let's steal some of this. Actually, let's not. Let's start it from scratch. So really what we were using was email, or name, email, and password. So let's go into the register user, and let's just make an array called user data. I mean, this is just one way of doing it. There's many ways you can do this. You don't have to always follow my strategy. And basically inside of that user data, I'm going to want the following: name, email, and password, but still use the same type of struct. So name, and we'll just that for now, and then we need email and password. So email and password. So basically I'm just making myself an array that's a lot more cleaner than using this whole request. I could just pass this in, to be honest, if I wanted to, but the problem with that is I've got this password confirmation here, and I don't really want that. I only want this, this, and that. This is what I'm mainly after. So with this, I'm going to quite easily just piggyback off the data string. So if I just comment this out, and let's see what happens if I try to do data name, like if I did on the auth controller. So see, we did this request name. Let's see if it works the same if I say data name. Send that off. You can see that it says we're getting a property of a none object. That's because this is now an array. So instead of data name like that, we want to make sure that we put it in brackets and quotes and send that off, and we get the correct name now. So for all of our data structs here for our array, we can easily say data name. Just copy this over and over again, format those lines, email and password. That's what we do. Have a look and make sure they're all the same. Make sure that we got some commas here. And let's DD our user data. Let's see what happens. So now we've got it nice and clean. We've got name, email, and password. Obviously, this is all the data that we need. The problem is that our password is incorrect because it's not encrypted yet. So we need to make sure that we encrypt that. So remember, in our controller, we use this thing called bcrypt. So let's do that. We can quite simply just put bcrypt here, like so, and then wrap this inside brackets. I think I spelled bcrypt completely wrong, I think. There we go. And now if I die and dump on my user data, let's see what happens. So now I have an encrypted password, which is pretty cool. So I can see that's going to go into my database, my email, and my name. That's perfect. So now we've got this data. So remember, this is our business logic, because now we're writing some sort of logic inside our own class. We now need to send this data to our database. And this is where the next part of the repository pattern comes in. The next part is to create the pattern of a repository, which the repositories are there to control anything that I do with inside my database. However, I also mentioned that we're going to add this other thing called a contract on top of it. And the contract kind of solidifies anything that I'm doing with the database. Therefore, I can't put anything incorrect in there. And you'll see exactly what's going to happen in a short second. But to do that, we need to create these repositories. We do exactly the same thing again. We're just going to make a new directory. And we're just going to call this repositories. That correctly? I think that is correct. Repositories. It's okay. And we're just going to make another folder in here called contracts. Okay. And basically we have a repository class, and then we're going to have a contract class. They're going to sound very familiar, but you'll see what we're going to do with them in a short while. So the first thing we're going to make is our repository. So we're going to make a new PHP class, and then make sure it's inside your repositories folder. Depends on what IDE you're using, it's entirely up to you. But we're going to call this class user repository. Nameful. Right, so we're going to call this user repository and say okay. And we can see that there is this user repository. However, we're also going to be using an implementation onto our contracts, and you'll see exactly what that is in a second. But let's just make that quickly. So we're going to make a new, and this time it's not actually going to be a class. This is going to be an interface we're going to create in here. So we're going to do right click, and I can't make a new interface here, but I can quite simply just make a new class if I wanted to. So a new class, and we're going to call it user repository contract. Okay, and it's going to be an interface. This is why I like using PHP Storm. It's nice and easy with stuff if you want to use it. And we say okay. So now we have this interface and we have this user repository. Now we need to make sure these two can talk to each other. So we can quite simply say on our user repository, we want to make sure that we implement. So implements, and we want to implement our user repository contract. You can see it already pulls all in. And you'll see exactly why we do that. So let's say, for example, in my repository, inside my contract, I want to have something to add a user. So I'll probably have a function inside my user repository called add user. Okay. Now this basically is saying I need to have this inside my user repository. So if we have a look at my user repository, you can see that we have this class saying, okay, well, we're missing something because we have this implement on this contract that we need to have this add user. Now this is the way how we can control everything of what we want to do with these interfaces and what we can do with these contracts. But before we do that, we need to make sure we can get it to talk to each other. So again, we need to make another construct. So for PHP Storm, I can do it quite easily. And obviously we want to use a user repository contract. And I'm going to call it $user repository contract. And then again, we're just going to put this user typing it over and over again. So you remove the $, is equal to user repository contract. And then obviously we just do a protected. So we're going to protect that variable like so. And now we have this instantiation from this class, which needs to go into this contract. Now, if I wanted to add something to the contract, I need to make sure that I put it inside the repository contract. So first things first is inside this auth controller, we're going to be doing this create bit, this user create. That's what it's there for. So if we go to the register user service, we can see that we've got this and we've died here. So we now need to go into our repository contract and we can say this repository contract, and we're going to make something exactly the same. Register user. Okay. And that way what we need to pass in is we need to pass in the user data into that. You can see this doesn't exist because we haven't made it yet. So we need to go into the contract and we quite easily make it. So public function, and we called it register user contract. And remember we passed in data, but this is also type of array. So just put that in. Now, obviously, because we have this interface, we need to make sure that we have it inside our repository. So you can see it's already shouting at me, but the cool thing about PHP Storm is if I type in the type int, you can see it's already saying I need this register user. If it doesn't type in for you, basically it's just the same function. And this time we're going to put some logic inside that register user. That easy, right? So all this is now is we've got our data. Now we just need to add it into our database. That's simple because we can quite easily just do a try catch just to make sure we don't have any errors. Again, this is just error handling. And basically we can steal this logic from our auth controller. So we can just rob this if we wanted to. Or I'm going to show you something new and cool. So we can say $new user, so this is inside our repository, is equal to a new user. And remember, we're going to come off the model. Unfortunately, that's inside app users. We're going to have to move that into its own thing. But you can see it's here. We should really move it into a folder, but we'll do that for the next few. And then with that new user, we're going to just use this cool little Laravel function or eloquent thing that we've got, which is called fill. And basically, it's going to look at anything that I have inside my database, or sorry, inside this data string. And if it matches anything with inside my table, so any of these. And if they're named correctly, it'll just fill in the data. So if I had like loads and loads of data inside that array and it all matched the same, it'll all work. And then just to save it, I can just do new user and save. That's simple. Really easy to do. And all I'm going to do is then return back my new user. So I'm just saying, okay, I've made my user. Let's send him back. And it's going to go back through the hierarchy of that repository pattern. Straightforward. If we wanted to catch any errors, well, we can just do exception $e, and then we can just return. Maybe if we want to, I wouldn't say return this specifically, but we can log it, and we'll do that when I make things like response helpers and stuff to make everything uniformed. But we're going to return E, and then we're just going to get the message, and that's going to return back any error message that we might have. So if this fails, we're going to get this error message back. Pretty cool, huh? So if we go into our register user, go back. So if we register this user, so once it's done, obviously we return that data from the repository. It's now coming back here. So we could call this $new user, and that will give us the user object. So just like this auth controller, this user gave me this user object. But now I need to make this token. So we can copy that and let's paste it under here. But this time it's going to be new user create token, because don't forget this is the object of what comes back from our repository. And then now we've created this token, we now need to send the data back. So we could quite easily say return some data back. So if I just had to return back new user, that won't quite work because I have a bit of information here. So we've got this success, user, and token. Now, normally what I tend to do is I'd make something like a data string. So we could have $data, sorry, a data array, not a string, sorry. And inside there, I'd have, if I've got two properties like user and token, I'd have user, and then that could be a new user. And then on top of that, I'd then have token. Token be this token. And then I'd return back this data. Okay. So now we've got all that data struct. So, oops, sorry, backspace too many. So we've created a new user using our repository contract. We've created our new token, and then we've got our data. If this is too confusing, don't worry about it. What we can do is we can take this out for now, and we can just pass back this new user. Pass that new user back. So ignore this. We won't do that just yet because it could be a bit confusing until we move into like our response helpers. Let's just ignore that for now, just so it makes a bit more sense, and I don't want to make this go on too long. So we register the user. We've got the user now, and we're sending the user back. We could have actually just put a return here instead of making a variable just to make it cleaner. But for beginners, we'll just keep it this way. So we're going to go back one. So we're going to go back into our controller, and we can see that this is where the user is getting set up. So I could just do $user is equal to this logic. We can now take this out because we're doing that inside our repository. And we can see our token can be created here now, and we get our response back. So let's see what happens if we run this. So let's go into Postman and let's send. And we can see here that we get this error message. So if we do it pretty, we can see that saying, okay, well, the app repository contract or the user repository contract is not instantiated whilst building. This is because we haven't set up anything to bind these two together. Because remember, we're using the contract and the repository. So we've got this repository and we've got this contract, but we've got nothing that binds these two together. So how do we do that? Well, the easiest way to do it is to create our own section for this. And this is inside our providers. And within the providers, we're just going to make a class inside there. Now, providers can be found here. And you can see we've got an app service provider, auth provider. We're going to look at these, but we're going to make a separate one here. So a new class, and we're going to call this repository service provider. Okay. So basically this is going to handle all our repositories that we're going to have. So every repository or any binds we need to make will go into this class. So we add that in, and this just needs to extend onto our service providers. So service provider, which is that one. Okay, so it's coming off our support of the service provider. This is again another Laravel thing that we have, and basically we can now start adding our binds. But first, we just need to add a wee bit of logic. First, we need to add in this public. It's called boot, if I remember. So public function boot. So this is when this loads up. Again, we don't really need to do anything with that logic just yet. But what we do need to do is we need to add in what is known as registers. So we're going to public function, and we want to register all our binds. So you can see that we already have this function predefined for us. Now what we need to do is we need to register all these binds that we have. Now we've only got one, but there will be more and more that we get with inside the app. So we go this, and it's going to be app because it is our application, and we're going to bind. Okay, so what we're going to bind is our two contracts and our repositories. So in this case, we have a user repository contract. That's it, and it's the class. And we want to attach, I forgot what it was then for a second, user repository class. So basically we're binding these together. So this is our user repository contract, and then our user repository. I'm just going to fix this up. If I see it, I need to fix it. So we're registering these two together, But this is still not going to work because we haven't told the application that we've got this new repository service provider. So how do we do that? Well, in our config, in our app.php, which controls pretty much our whole project, if we go all the way down to the bottom, you can see we've got this list of providers. And now we just need to add in our new provider. So we can duplicate this last line. And remember, we called it repository service provider. Save that. And now if we run our code base, it should technically work. And there we go. So we have a success message. Our user is now here, and we now have our token. And that's using a full structure of a repository pattern. Now it might be a little bit confusing, but it saves us making so much of the same work over and over again. It's dead straightforward. Remember, all we had to do was make a service. I've just spotted that. So we make a service. Actually, we can get rid of that because we don't need it. So we just made a service. The service is controlling our business logic. So remember, inside our service, we have a bit of business logic. So we made this little array of data that we were going to pass to our repository, which was going to deal with anything that was database orientated. So anything we're going to add or retrieve or whatever. And then that's going to create we'll go into the repository contract. Now we have to instantiate that first. So we need to make sure that we've got this here. So the register user. Notice that it doesn't have any function brackets or curlies because it doesn't need it, because we're just saying that we need this here. And then inside our repository, we need to make sure we add it in with the exact same data, so array data. And you can see that we did our logic for that register user. We looked at this cool thing called fill, which will fill anything that was relevant to the data that we have inside our table from this array. And we just saved it, and then we just sent back the new user model. And that was it. We then have all our data. It comes all the way back. So we made this thing called new user, returns back, and we go back another step, and then we have all our data. This is the user model again, the token, and then we just made this cool little JSON response here. And that's pretty much it. That's how you do the whole repository pattern. This is quite a crazy session. It's quite a lot to take in. But once you understand how that process works of creating your service, then to your repository, then to your contract, it makes life a lot more easier when it comes to developing. And you can call specific services if you need it, instead of writing whole new queries. So let's say, for example, you want to get all the users on, I don't know, on likes, for example. So you're going to see all the users that like something. You could do that by just calling one service instead of writing the code twice or 3 times. It just removes the duplication of code. I hope that's been helpful. Remember, if you do find that, well, I would say entertaining, coding's never entertaining, but if you find it useful, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, which is just here somewhere. It's not on mine. Don't forget, we have a good Discord. People are joining, which is pretty cool. Nice to see you guys there. Obviously Twitter, and if you want to join, you're more than welcome to join. But obviously viewing these videos and liking them is more than enough for me. It's been great taking you for this episode, and I hope to see you in the next one, where we're going to actually log in the users. So we've created one, and we're going to learn how to log them in. I'll see you in that one. Goodbye.